In the final part of the last lecture, I'd like to reflect on, given all that we have said about the importance of this decision, whether it was a good idea to ask the people to vote on EU membership. The main reason I am raising this point is because it's not normally how things are done in the United Kingdom. There have been just two UK-wide referendums, one of which was the 1975 EEC referendum that I talked a bit about in week 4. The other is the less well-known 2011 referendum on changing the voting system. Instead of asking the people to have a direct say on a particular matter, the UK political system normally works on the basis of representative democracy, i.e., we elect representatives to take decisions on our behalf. Every few years, in a general election, there's a chance to vote them out of office if we're not happy with their performance. In this way, Parliament is constantly renewed and the laws it passes are also reviewed and often changed. Edmund Burke, a famous British parliamentarian of the 18th century, expressed his distaste for letting the people decide, as we can see in this quote. He is against authoritative instructions, mandates that bind representatives of the people to what public opinion is at any one time on any particular subject. And Burke's views then have greatly influenced British political culture, in the sense that British political parties have long revered Parliament and parliamentary sovereignty. That means that asking the people to decide and in effect bind Parliament, send out binding instructions or mandate, that is atypical in a British context. So it's a paradox to hear politicians that advocate a withdrawal from the EU in order to secure the democratic rights of Britons, as expressed by their Parliament, when in fact the decision to hold a referendum is itself a rejection of the parliamentary model of democracy. Remember that up to now, it has been the elected Parliament that made important EU-related decisions, such as the vote to join the European Economic Community, or that has subsequently ratified EU treaties since that time. Here we should also reflect on the implications of a vote to leave the EU from the perspective of the UK Parliament. For ultimately, it is up to members of the House of Commons to decide how to interpret the vote by the people. The government needs the support of a majority of Parliament to start withdrawal negotiations and, in the event of a deal, to ratify that particular withdrawal arrangement with the EU. The complications here begin with the reality that the House of Commons actually has a strong pro-EU majority. As this BBC News article that I've mentioned in this slide shows, only 147 MPs have said that they want to leave, compared with 454 who back remaining in the EU. In this context, Parliament is very unlikely to simply ignore a majority vote of the public if the public chooses to leave. However, MPs have significant power to shape how exactly the UK might withdraw from the EU. And as the headline from this article states, Parliament can ensure the UK gets a deal to stay in the single market, but this would mean accepting free movement of people, which is probably not what most of the people voting to leave actually want. So the risk associated with a referendum is that by itself, the decision produced by a referendum, by asking the people directly, does not actually determine the terms on which the UK withdraws. What follows from this is that there could indeed be another referendum if Parliament considers that any new trade arrangement ought to get a popular seal of approval. I should add that a decision to stay in the EU also does not preclude another EU referendum in the future. The 2011 European Union Act, passed by the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government, that act specifies that any new EU treaty transferring new powers to Brussels has to be put to a referendum. So if a future UK government agrees to a new treaty that, for instance, gives the EU more powers on security and defence, this would automatically trigger a referendum. Enlargement of the EU, however, would not trigger this so-called referendum lock because enlargement does not constitute a transfer of policy competencies. A final risk to consider when evaluating the merits of holding an in-out referendum is the possibility of how the final result will actually be determined when we add up all the votes across the UK. In week 4, you'll probably recall when I discussed divides among the British electorate, I analysed how different parts of the UK differ over their attachment to the EU. So in this context, let's consider this hypothetical scenario as represented here on the slide. We could have a situation where in England there is a 5% lead in favour of leaving the EU, 52.5% against 47.5% to remain. But nevertheless, there could still be a very slight UK-wide majority to remain based on the votes from other parts of the UK. Remember, Northern Ireland and Scotland in particular then have much higher levels, at least as we estimate from the polls at the moment, of voting to stay in the EU. And again, this then is the kind of conundrum that direct democracy can throw up and which Parliament would have to resolve. Hence, the last question for the discussion forums is this: knowing the risks associated with such a referendum, do you think it's a good idea? By way of a conclusion, I want to recap 4 essential points covered in this lecture. The first is that there is a medium to high risk of economic uncertainty and hence associated lower economic growth in the event that the UK leaves the EU. This would not last so long if the UK finds a speedy way to stay in the single market. However, that is a very big assumption to make. Staying in the EU certainly does not carry any risk of short-term economic disruption. Nevertheless, there are risks associated with such a choice. Primarily, there is a clear medium to high risk of migration from new EU countries if there is more enlargement. That is, on top of the existing levels of migration from the other 27 countries that there are today. Thirdly, we discussed the fact that there is a tension between representative democracy and direct democracy. The use of a referendum, which is an instrument of direct democracy, constrains the UK Parliament as it takes discretion away from elected representatives. In essence, that is the very point of the exercise, as it implies that these representatives cannot be trusted on the EU question. That is a message the Leave camp has made hay with recently. But at the same time, advocates of withdrawing from the EU are amongst the staunchest defenders of the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. So there's obviously a tension here. Fourthly and finally, the tension between these two forms of democratic decision-making is bound to come into the open in the case of a vote to leave. This is because the Parliament is not technically bound by the decision of the people. But rather than imagine a scenario whereby MPs simply reject the outcome, the problem here is one in which it will be the government and its parliamentary majority that negotiates the technicalities of withdrawing from the EU. As there is currently an explicit pro-EU majority in Parliament, this could well lead to a negotiation that keeps the UK in the single market. But that means accepting free movement of people, which is hardly, I think, what most Leave voters will have in mind when casting their ballots. Ultimately, therefore, the referendum comes down to a messy choice between a status quo that will leave many very dissatisfied and a new arrangement that could end up being similarly disappointing after a period of economic disruption. Whatever the result, There will be plenty of discussion then about whether it was a good idea to decide the UK's relations with the EU in this fashion. In due course, history will tell us what UK voters, as well as citizens in other countries, made of this momentous vote.